July 23, 1970. The mist clung to the ridges of Thua Thien province like the breath of ghosts, rolling between emerald valleys that had witnessed more death than most nations. 700 meters above sea level, fire support base Ripcord perched on its rocky summit, like a steel crown on a dying king. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth, diesel fuel, and something else, the metallic tang of impending violence that every soldier learns to recognize but never grows comfortable. Sergeant Michael Dorsey knelt beside his M60 machine gun, field stripping the weapon with the methodical precision of a man who understood that his life depended on 7 pounds of steel and engineering. His hands moved with practiced certainty across the feed cover, bolt and barrel, motions refined through countless hours in the Georgia heat of Fort Benning, now applied in a war zone where the humidity made metal sweat and ammunition corrode. The machine gun's bipod legs were planted firmly in sandbags that had been filled and refilled so many times they bore the stains of a dozen firefights. Around him, fire support base Ripcord hummed with the nervous energy of men who knew they were sitting on borrowed time. The 400-man garrison of the 101st Airborne Division had transformed this mountaintop into a fortress of concertina wire, claymore mines, and 105mm howitzers that could rain death on any enemy foolish enough to approach. But fortresses, as history had taught again and again, were only as strong as the supply lines that fed them. And in the summer of 1970, those supply lines stretched thin as spider silk across a jungle that never forgave and never forgot. The helicopter landing zone occupied the center of the firebase, a cleared circle of red dirt that served as the lifeline between this isolated outpost and the world beyond. Every Huey that touched down brought ammunition, water, medical supplies, and mail from home. Every Huey that lifted off carried wounded soldiers, intelligence reports, and sometimes the bodies of men who would never see home again. The mathematics of war had reduced human existence to cargo manifests and weight calculations. How many pounds of ammunition versus how many pounds of medical supplies? How many fresh troops versus how much food for the garrison? But on this morning, as Sergeant Dorsey cleaned his weapon and watched the mist roll through the valleys below, the American command structure suffered from a dangerous delusion that would soon cost lives in ways no one could have predicted. The arrogance was subtle but lethal, the kind of overconfidence that had plagued military leaders throughout history when they confused technological superiority with invincibility. At Camp Evans, 30 kilometers to the northeast, staff officers studied topographical maps and intelligence reports with the calm assurance of men who had never climbed a mountain under fire. The terrain around Ripcord appeared to favor the defenders, steep slopes that would channel any attacking force into killing zones, clear fields of fire that extended for hundreds of meters, and elevation advantages that made artillery support devastatingly effective. On paper, fire support base Ripcord was impregnable. Colonel Andre Lucas, commanding the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne, had established Ripcord as part of Operation Texas Star, designed to interdict North Vietnamese supply lines moving through the A Shau Valley. The strategic logic was sound: control the high ground, dominate the valley approaches, and force the enemy to reveal himself in costly frontal assaults. American doctrine emphasized firepower and mobility, the technological advantages that had won wars from the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. What the planners failed to fully appreciate was that the North Vietnamese army had spent 5 years adapting to American tactics, learning to turn American strengths into weaknesses. Intelligence reports suggested that the NVA 324B division operated in the region, but estimates placed their strength at no more than a reinforced regiment, perhaps 2,000 men scattered across multiple objectives. The assessment concluded that any assault on Ripcord would be a diversionary attack, a probe designed to draw American forces away from more significant operations elsewhere. The North Vietnamese, according to American analysis, lacked the heavy weapons and logistical capability to sustain a prolonged siege against a well-fortified position supported by air power and artillery. This assumption would prove fatally wrong. In the valleys and ridgelines surrounding fire support base Ripcord, Colonel Nguyen Tuong and the 324B Division had been preparing for months. Soviet-supplied 122mm rockets were positioned in caves and concealed bunkers. Mortar crews had pre-registered their fires on every structure within the firebase perimeter. Sapper teams had mapped approach routes through the wire, identifying weak points in the defensive structure that American engineers had considered impenetrable. The North Vietnamese had learned from previous battles that American bases, despite their impressive firepower, depended entirely on helicopter resupply. Disrupt the landing zone, maintain sustained fire on approaching aircraft, and the fortress would slowly starve. They had studied American helicopter tactics, noting flight patterns, fuel limitations, and the predictable responses to different types of attacks. What appeared to be a random guerrilla force was actually a sophisticated military organization that had transformed the jungle itself into a weapon. The M60 machine gun that Sergeant Dorsey maintained represented the pinnacle of American small arms technology. Firing the 7.62mm NATO cartridge at 550 rounds per minute, the weapon could deliver accurate suppressive fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The gun's quick-change barrel system allowed sustained fire operations, while its belt-fed ammunition system provided volume of fire that individual riflemen could never match. In the hands of a trained crew, the M60 could dominate a battlefield, breaking up enemy formations and providing cover for friendly maneuver. But every advantage came with corresponding vulnerabilities. The M60 consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. A single minute of sustained fire required more than 500 cartridges. Each round weighed approximately 25 grams, meaning that a basic combat load of 1,000 rounds added 25 kilograms to a soldier's equipment. Multiply that by the dozen M60s positioned around Ripcord's perimeter, and the logistical requirements became staggering. Every bullet had to be manufactured in American factories, shipped across the Pacific Ocean, transported through South Vietnamese ports, and finally carried by helicopter to the firebase. The supply chain stretched 10,000 miles and required the coordination of thousands of personnel. The helicopter crews that served this supply line represented some of the most skilled aviators in military history. Flying UH-1 Hueys and CH-47 Chinooks, they navigated mountain weather that could change from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. They operated in an environment where every landing zone might be under observation, where every approach could trigger an ambush, where mechanical failure at altitude meant death for crew and passengers alike. Captain William Estes, commanding UH-1 Slick aircraft with the 158th Assault Helicopter Battalion, had already logged more than 800 combat flight hours over Vietnamese battlefields. His crew chief, Specialist Gary Morrison, could replace a door gunner's M60 barrel, while the helicopter performed evasive maneuvers under fire. Door gunner Private First Class Robert Chen had learned to anticipate muzzle flashes in the jungle below, engaging targets before they could track his aircraft. Together, they represented the kind of combat experience that no training program could provide, men who had survived long enough to master their deadly profession. The weather around Fire Support Base Ripcord added another layer of complexity to military. The summer monsoon season brought daily thunderstorms that reduced visibility to zero and turned landing zones into quagmires. Rain struck with tropical intensity, turning dust to mud and making every surface slippery. Metal equipment corroded with shocking speed. Weapons required constant maintenance. Radio antennas collected moisture that interfered with communications, and electronic equipment failed with alarming frequency. Temperature variations between day and night created condensation inside sensitive instruments. Helicopter engines operating at high altitude in hot, humid conditions produced less power, reducing payload capacity and forcing pilots to calculate weight and balance equations on every mission. The physics of flight became a constant enemy. Every pound of ammunition carried meant one less pound of fuel, medical supplies, or water. The men of Fire Support Base Ripcord had adapted to these conditions with the ingenuity that American soldiers had displayed throughout history. They learned to wrap ammunition in plastic to protect it from moisture. They discovered that machine gun barrels changed point of impact as they heated up, requiring constant adjustment of sights. They found that radio batteries lasted half as long in the humidity, forcing them to establish communication schedules that conserved power while maintaining contact with higher command. But adaptation had its limits. As June 1970 drew to a close, intelligence reports began suggesting increased enemy activity in the valleys surrounding the firebase. Long-range patrols reported finding fresh trail signs, boot prints in the mud, abandoned campsites that still smoldered, and the kind of systematic reconnaissance that preceded major attacks. Radio intercepts picked up increased North Vietnamese communications, though the messages remained encrypted and their exact meaning unclear. The signs were there for anyone willing to read them. The jungle around Ripcord was being systematically infiltrated by enemy forces who understood that patience was their greatest weapon. They could afford to wait, to probe, to study American defensive patterns and identify weaknesses. Time was on their side. Every day that passed allowed them to position more weapons, dig deeper bunkers, and prepare more thoroughly for the coming assault. On the evening of June 30th, as Sergeant Dorsey performed his final weapons check before rotating to night watch, the firebase settled into the uneasy quiet that preceded violence. The tropical darkness fell like a curtain, reducing the world to the small circle of light cast by red-filtered flashlights and the distant glow of flares dropped by circling aircraft. In the bunkers and fighting positions around the perimeter, American soldiers cleaned weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to push aside the growing certainty that something terrible was approaching through the darkness. They did not have long to wait. At 0347 hours, on July 1st, 1970, the first mortar round impacted inside the perimeter of Fire Support Base Ripcord, detonating near the command bunker with a flash that temporarily blinded men who had grown accustomed to the darkness. The explosion was followed immediately by a dozen more 82mm rounds that fell with the analytical precision of weapons crews who had spent weeks calculating exact ranges and deflections. The bombardment was not random harassment fire, but a carefully orchestrated attack designed to destroy specific targets within the firebase. The first rounds targeted the communication antennas, severing the electronic links that connected Ripcord to Camp Evans and the outside world. The second salvo concentrated on the helicopter landing zone, cratering the packed earth and scattering debris across the approach routes that incoming aircraft would need to use. The third wave focused on the 105mm howitzers, attempting to silence the American artillery before it could respond with counter-battery fire. Sergeant Dorsey rolled out of his sleeping as shrapnel whistled through the air above his bunker. His first instinct was to reach for his M60, but explosions were walking across the firebase with mechanical regularity, and movement above ground meant death. The sound was unlike anything most soldiers had experienced. Not the scattered crack of random sniper fire or the distant rumble of artillery in another sector, but the sustained roar of a bombardment designed to destroy everything within a precisely defined area. The mortar attack continued for 17 minutes, during which more than 200 rounds fell within the firebase perimeter. American casualties mounted rapidly, not from direct hits, which were often fatal, but from flying debris, collapsed bunkers, and the psychological shock of sustained bombardment at close quarters. Men who had survived months of combat found themselves reduced to cowering animals, pressing their faces into the mud and praying that the next explosion would fall somewhere else. When the bombardment finally ceased, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had. In that silence, every surviving American on the firebase understood that the mortars had been merely the opening movement of a larger symphony of destruction. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, enemy forces were preparing to advance, using the confusion and casualties caused by the bombardment to close the distance to the American perimeter. Sergeant Dorsey emerged from his bunker to find a landscape transformed by violence. The helicopter landing zone was a moonscape of overlapping craters, making it impossible for aircraft to land safely. The command bunker had taken a direct hit, killing the firebase commander and severing radio contact with higher headquarters. 2 of the 105mm howitzers had been damaged, reducing American artillery capability by nearly half. Most critically, several M60 positions around the perimeter had been destroyed or abandoned, creating gaps in the defensive firepower that enemy infantry could exploit. Without orders from his dead commander, without radio contact with Camp Evans, and without clear information about enemy strength or intentions, Dorsey made the kind of decision that separates combat soldiers from parade ground troops. He dragged his M60 from its original position to a destroyed bunker on the firebase's western perimeter, where incoming mortar fire had created a perfect field of fire down the slope toward the jungle below. The move violated standard doctrine. Machine gunners were supposed to remain in prepared positions that provided maximum protection, but standard doctrine had not anticipated a situation where half the firebase's defensive positions had been eliminated in the opening moments of the battle. As he set up his weapon in the new position, Dorsey could hear movement in the darkness below, not the random sounds of animals or wind through the trees, but the purposeful sounds of human beings moving with military discipline through difficult terrain. The North Vietnamese assault forces were climbing the slopes toward the firebase, using the cover of darkness and the confusion caused by the mortar attack to close the distance that separated them from the American perimeter. The The tactical situation faced by the defenders of fire support base Ripcord represented one of the most difficult challenges in warfare, defending a fixed position against a numerically superior enemy who had achieved tactical surprise. The firebase's high ground advantage was partially offset by the isolation that prevented rapid reinforcement. The American technological advantages in communications and air support had been degraded by the opening bombardment. Most importantly, the defenders faced an enemy who had demonstrated clear superiority in planning, coordination, and tactical intelligence. But the American soldiers at Ripcord possessed advantages that could not be measured in technical specifications or order of battle charts. They were volunteers who had survived the rigorous selection and training processes of the 101st Airborne Division. They had been forged into a cohesive fighting unit through months of combat operations in one of the world's most demanding environments. They understood their weapons, their tactics, and each other with the kind of intimacy that only combat can create. More importantly, they understood that surrender was not an option. The North Vietnamese army had demonstrated throughout the war that American prisoners received treatment that often proved fatal. Captured soldiers faced torture, starvation, and execution, fates that motivated desperate resistance even in hopeless situations. The defenders of Ripcord fought with the knowledge that their only choice was victory or death. As the first North Vietnamese soldiers appeared at the edge of the firebase perimeter, Sergeant Dorsey opened fire with his M60, sending tracers arcing through the darkness toward muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared among the trees. The sound of his weapon was immediately answered by rifle fire from positions around the perimeter. American soldiers who had survived the opening bombardment and were now engaging enemy infantry at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The firefight that erupted around fire support base Ripcord represented infantry combat at its most primitive and deadly level. Despite the technological sophistication of the weapons involved, the battle quickly devolved into a close-quarters struggle where survival depended on individual courage, tactical skill, and the kind of split-second decision-making that no training program could fully simulate. Soldiers fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness, threw grenades at sounds that might or might not be enemy movement, and called for support from weapons systems that might or might not be operational. The M60 machine gun in Sergeant Dorsey's hands became the focal point of the western sector's defense. The weapon's sustained fire capability allowed him to break up enemy formations before they could coordinate their own assault tactics. The psychological effect of machine gun fire was often as important as its ballistic impact. The continuous stream of tracers served notice to attacking forces that the position was still manned and actively defended. But machine gun operations under combat conditions required more than individual heroism. Each M60 crew consisted of 3 men, a gunner who aimed and fired the weapon, an assistant gunner who fed ammunition and helped carry the gun between positions, and an ammunition bearer who maintained the supply of linked cartridges that kept the weapon operational. When casualties mounted, these crew-served weapons often became less effective, as surviving personnel attempted to perform multiple functions simultaneously. Dorsey found himself operating alone, without the assistant gunner and ammunition bearer who would normally support machine gun operators. He was forced to feed ammunition belts with one hand while aiming and firing with the other, a technique that reduced accuracy but maintained the volume of fire necessary to suppress enemy movement. When his first barrel overheated from sustained firing, he performed a barrel change by himself, using an asbestos glove to remove the red-hot component and install a replacement in darkness while enemy fire impacted around his position. The North Vietnamese assault forces had studied American defensive tactics extensively and understood the central role that machine guns played in perimeter defense. They concentrated their fire on known M60 positions, using rocket-propelled grenades and concentrated rifle fire to eliminate the crew-served weapon that anchored American resistance. The attackers moved in small groups, advancing by rushes, while other elements provided covering fire, tactics that maximized their numerical advantage while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. As the battle intensified, Sergeant Dorsey realized that his position was becoming the focus of increasingly concentrated enemy attention. Rifle fire cracked past his head with the distinctive snap that indicated bullets passing within inches of their target. Grenades exploded close enough to shower him with dirt and debris, while rocket-propelled grenades detonated against the bunker walls with bone-jarring concussions that left his ears ringing and his vision blurred. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Other machine gun positions around the perimeter had fallen silent, whether due to casualties, mechanical failure, or ammunition shortage was impossible to determine in the darkness and confusion of close combat. American rifle fire was becoming sporadic as individual soldiers were killed or wounded, creating gaps in the defensive line that enemy forces could exploit. Most critically, the firebase was running out of ammunition for the heavy weapons that provided the bulk of its defensive firepower. It was at this moment, when military disaster seemed inevitable, that the first UH-1 helicopter appeared over fire support base Ripcord, flying without lights in the pre-dawn darkness. Captain William Estes had determined that his aircraft could navigate by the muzzle flashes and explosions that marked the battle's location, using the sound and light of combat as an improvised navigation system. His mission was to deliver ammunition to the firebase's defenders and evacuate the most seriously wounded operations that would normally require secure landing zones and coordinated ground support. The helicopter's arrival changed the tactical equation in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. For the American defenders, the aircraft represented resupply and medical evacuation, the difference between continued resistance and inevitable collapse. For the North Vietnamese attackers, the helicopter was both target and opportunity. Destroying it would eliminate American resupply while providing a significant propaganda victory. Captain Estes faced a decision that epitomized the moral complexity of the Vietnam War. Standard operating procedures prohibited helicopter operations in unsecured landing zones under direct fire. The risks to aircraft and crew were considered unacceptable, particularly when balanced against the uncertain benefits of resupplying an isolated position. But the pilot could see tracers crossing the firebase and hear the desperation in radio transmissions from the ground. He understood that men were dying and that his aircraft might be their only hope for survival. The helicopter descent into fire support base Ripcord required flying skills that bordered on the impossible. Estes had to navigate by instruments and visual reference to muzzle flashes, maintaining precise control of his aircraft while enemy fire impacted around the rotor disc and cabin. His crew chief and door gunners returned fire with their own M60s, attempting to suppress enemy positions while the pilot maneuvered for landing. The convergence of multiple combat systems, helicopter aviation, machine gun fire, and infantry tactics created a three-dimensional battlefield where altitude became another factor in tactical calculation. As the helicopter touched down in the crater-marked landing zone, Sergeant Dorsey and other surviving defenders rushed forward to unload ammunition crates and carry wounded soldiers to the aircraft. The operation required extraordinary coordination under fire, with men performing complex tasks while bullets impacted around them and explosions illuminated the scene with brief flashes of light. Each ammunition crate weighed more than 50 pounds and contained linked 7.62mm cartridges that would keep the M60s firing for another few minutes of combat. The helicopter remained on the ground for less than 3 minutes, long enough to unload critical supplies and embark the most seriously wounded casualties. As the aircraft lifted off, Dorsey could see other helicopters approaching through the darkness, part of an improvised airlift operation that was being coordinated by pilots and ground controllers without benefit of secure communications or established procedure. The military aviation system was adapting in real time to combat conditions that had not been anticipated in peacetime training. But helicopter operations under these conditions exacted a terrible cost. Enemy fire intensified as additional aircraft approached the firebase, with North Vietnamese forces concentrating their efforts on shooting down the helicopters that represented American tactical mobility. Anti-aircraft machine guns acquired target solutions on the slow-moving, while rocket-propelled grenades attempted to engage the helicopters during their most vulnerable landing and takeoff. The third helicopter to attempt landing was struck by multiple weapons as it approached the firebase. The aircraft's engine failed, sending the helicopter into an auto-rotation that ended in a crash landing inside the perimeter. The impact killed 2 crew members instantly and set the aircraft's fuel system ablaze, creating a beacon that illuminated the entire firebase for enemy gunners. The crash also blocked a portion of the landing zone, making subsequent helicopter operations even more difficult and dangerous. Sergeant Dorsey watched the helicopter burn and understood that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The firebase was now completely dependent on ammunition stocks that were being consumed at unsustainable rates. Each burst from his M60 represented cartridges that could not be replaced until, and if, another helicopter managed to land successfully. The mathematics of combat had reduced to simple arithmetic, bullets fired versus bullets available, with the difference measured in human lives. The North Vietnamese forces recognized that the American position was becoming untenable and intensified their attacks accordingly. Fresh assault teams moved forward to replace casualties and maintain pressure on the defensive perimeter. Mortar fire resumed, targeting the remaining M60 positions with increased accuracy as enemy observers adjusted their fires based on American muzzle flashes. Most ominously, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery began echoing across the firebase, an indication that enemy heavy weapons were being brought into action. The 122mm rockets that began falling on fire support base Ripcord represented Soviet military technology at its most effective. These weapons delivered high explosive warheads with twice the destructive power of the mortars that had opened the attack, and their longer range allowed North Vietnamese crews to fire from positions that were immune to American counter-battery fire. The rockets arrived with the sound of freight trains, detonating with earth-shaking concussions that collapsed bunkers and eliminated entire fighting positions. As dawn began breaking over the mountains of Thua Thien province, the scope of the battle became visible in ways that darkness had previously concealed. Fire support base Ripcord was surrounded by enemy forces who had moved to within hand grenade range of the American perimeter. The firebase's defensive positions showed the effects of sustained bombardment, collapsed bunkers, destroyed equipment, and casualty-strewn fighting positions that testified to the intensity of the night's combat. Sergeant Dorsey surveyed the tactical situation from his machine gun position and recognized that the firebase was facing annihilation unless American advantages in air power and artillery could be brought to bear effectively. The North Vietnamese had achieved near-perfect tactical surprise and had demonstrated both the capability and determination to sustain their attack until the American position was completely overrun. The question was no longer whether Ripcord could be held indefinitely, but whether its defenders could survive long enough for relief forces to organize and execute a counterattack. The helicopter crews who continued flying resupply missions to fire support base Ripcord during the daylight hours of July 1st displayed the kind of courage that defined American military aviation during the Vietnam War. They flew into a landing zone that was under direct observation by enemy forces, knowing that each approach subjected their aircraft and crews to concentrated fire from multiple weapon systems. The mathematics of survival were working against them. Every successful landing increased the probability that the next mission would end in disaster. Captain Estes and his crew returned to the firebase 3 more times during the morning hours, each mission becoming progressively more dangerous as North Vietnamese forces adjusted their tactics to counter helicopter operations. Anti-aircraft machine guns were repositioned to create interlocking fields of fire over the landing zone. Rocket-propelled grenade teams concentrated their efforts on engaging helicopters during the critical moments of landing and takeoff, when evasive maneuvering was impossible. The 4th helicopter to be shot down over fire support base Ripcord crashed outside the perimeter, killing all 4 crew members and eliminating another aircraft from the resupply operation. The loss represented more than just materiel damage. The crew had possessed irreplaceable combat experience and specialized skills that had developed over months of combat operations. Their death marked a degradation in American capability that could not be compensated by technological superiority or tactical doctrine. But the helicopter crews continued flying. They adapted their tactics to counter enemy countermeasures, approaching the firebase from different directions and varying their flight profiles to complicate enemy fire control solutions. They learned to coordinate with ground forces to suppress anti-aircraft positions during critical landing phases. Most importantly, they maintained the flow of ammunition and medical supply that kept the firebase's defenders alive and fighting. For Sergeant Dorsey and the other machine gunners defending the perimeter, each helicopter arrival meant another belt of ammunition, another few minutes of sustained fire capability, and another opportunity to break up enemy assault formations. The M60 had become more than just a weapon. It represented the central nervous system of American defensive operations, the one system that could deliver sufficient firepower to disrupt enemy tactics, while remaining mobile enough to respond to changing tactical situations. But machine gun operations exacted a physical toll that went beyond simple combat fatigue. The weapon's sustained fire capability required crew members to handle hundreds of pounds of ammunition, perform barrel changes on guns that were too hot to touch without protective equipment, and maintain accuracy while operating under the stress of close combat. Dorsey's hands were covered with burns from that radiated through supposedly insulated surfaces. His shoulder ached from the weapon's recoil, transmitted through its bipod mount into his body during hours of continuous firing. The psychological stress was equally demanding. Machine gunners drew concentrated enemy fire because their weapons represented the greatest threat to attacking forces. They became high-priority targets for enemy snipers, rocket-propelled grenade teams, and mortar crews who understood that eliminating crew-served weapons would facilitate successful assault tactics. The constant knowledge that enemy forces were actively hunting them added a layer of stress to combat operations that affected decision-making and tactical performance. As July 1st progressed, the battle for fire support base Ripcord evolved into a sustained siege that tested both sides' ability to maintain combat operations under extreme conditions. The North Vietnamese had demonstrated their capability to mount coordinated attacks with heavy weapons support, achieving tactical surprise and inflicting serious casualties on American forces. But they had also revealed their presence in sufficient numbers to justify major American countermeasures, including B-52 strikes and multi-battalion relief operations. The American response began developing during the afternoon hours, as intelligence analysts pieced together the scope and nature of the attack on Ripcord. Long-range patrols and aerial reconnaissance revealed enemy forces in positions throughout the valleys surrounding the firebase. Radio intercepts indicated coordinated command and control structures that suggested regimental or division-level operations. The attack on Ripcord was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger North Vietnamese offensive designed to challenge American control of the A Shau Valley. But mounting an effective relief operation required time that the defenders of fire support base Ripcord might not have. Enemy forces were maintaining pressure on the perimeter, using mortar and rocket fire to prevent American forces from rest and resupply. Casualties continued mounting as defensive positions were systematically reduced by accurate enemy fire. Most critically, ammunition stocks were being consumed faster than helicopter resupply could maintain them, creating a logistics crisis that threatened to render the firebase's weapons ineffective. Sergeant Dorsey found himself rationing machine gun ammunition with the precision of a mathematician calculating resources against time. Each burst had to achieve maximum tactical effect, breaking up enemy formations, suppressing specific threats, or covering friendly movement between positions. Reconnaissance by fire, the technique of shooting at suspected enemy positions to provoke response, became a luxury that the firebase could no longer afford. Every cartridge had to contribute directly to defensive operations, or it represented waste that could prove fatal. The North Vietnamese forces surrounding fire support base Ripcord faced their own logistical challenges, though these were less visible to American observers. Moving heavy weapons up mountain slopes required enormous physical effort and careful coordination. Ammunition for mortars and rockets had to be carried by porters who navigated jungle trails while avoiding American aerial surveillance. Most importantly, sustaining the attack required continuous replacement of casualties as assault forces were reduced by defensive fire. But the North Vietnamese possessed advantages that offset these logistical difficulties. They operated on familiar terrain, using trail networks and supply caches that had been developed over months of preparation. Their forces included local recruits who understood the topography and weather patterns that affected military operation. Most critically, they could afford to accept casualty rates that American forces would consider unacceptable, giving them tactical options that were not available to their opponents. The siege of fire support base Ripcord entered its second day with both sides understanding that the outcome would depend on endurance rather than tactical brilliance. The Americans had to maintain defensive operations long enough for relief forces to organize and execute successful counterattack. The North Vietnamese had to sustain their assault until American defensive capabilities collapsed completely. The battle had become a test of national will, conducted through the medium of individual soldiers who faced death with every decision they made. On the morning of July 2nd, Sergeant Dorsey performed his daily weapon maintenance ritual with the kind of attention to detail that separated combat veterans from inexperienced soldiers. His M60 had fired more than 3,000 rounds during the previous day's fighting, subjecting its components to stresses that exceeded peacetime specifications. The barrel showed signs of erosion from high-velocity projectiles, while the bolt and operating rod displayed wear patterns that indicated the weapon was approaching the limits of its mechanical reliability. But the machine gun continued functioning, delivering accurate fire when called upon and cycling through its firing sequence with the mechanical precision that American manufacturing standards demanded. The weapon represented the culmination of decades of small arms development, incorporating lessons learned through 2 world wars and the Korean conflict. Its reliability under extreme conditions provided American forces with a technological advantage that partially offset the numerical superiority enjoyed by enemy forces. The helicopter operations that continued throughout the siege of Fire Support Base Ripcord represented military aviation at its most demanding level. Pilots navigated mountain weather that included sudden thunderstorms, visibility reduced to zero by cloud cover, and wind currents that could slam aircraft into mountainsides without warning. They operated in an environment where every landing zone might be under enemy observation, and every approach could trigger coordinated anti-aircraft fire. The UH-1 helicopters that served as the primary resupply aircraft for the firebase represented compromise solutions to multiple engineering challenges. Their turbine engines provided the power necessary to operate at high altitude, but fuel consumption at maximum power setting limited their range and payload capacity. The aircraft's aluminum construction kept weight to a minimum while providing structural strength, but offered limited protection against ground fire. Most critically, the helicopter's dependence on complex mechanical systems made them vulnerable to combat damage that could cause catastrophic failure. Captain William Estes had accumulated more than 1,000 combat flight hours by the time the siege of Ripcord began, experience that included operations in every major battle zone of the Vietnam War. He had learned to read the jungle like a combat infantryman, identifying landing zones that offered concealment from enemy observation and approach routes that minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. His crew had developed the kind of teamwork that allowed them to perform complex operations under fire without verbal communication. The door gunners who manned the M60 machine guns, mounted on either side of the helicopter, had learned to integrate their fires with ground operations, providing suppressive fire that allowed friendly forces to maneuver between positions. They understood the tactical relationship between air and ground operations in ways that peacetime training could never fully simulate. Their ability to deliver accurate fire from moving aircraft represented skills that required months of combat experience to develop. But helicopter crews paid a price for their specialized capability. The aircraft they flew were high-value targets that drew concentrated enemy fire during every mission. Crew members faced the psychological stress of knowing that mechanical failure or enemy action could result in crashes that offered little chance of survival. The combination of combat operations and demanding flight conditions produced casualty rates that exceeded those experienced by most ground combat units. The North Vietnamese forces surrounding Fire Support Base Ripcord had studied American helicopter tactics extensively and developed countermeasures that exploited the aircraft's operational limitations. Anti-aircraft machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that helicopters could not avoid when approaching the firebase. Rocket-propelled grenade teams learned to calculate lead times and engagement ranges that maximized their probability of engaging successfully. Most importantly, enemy forces demonstrated tactical patience, allowing helicopters to establish predictable flight patterns before concentrating their fires. The battle for control of Fire Support Base Ripcord's airspace represented a three-dimensional chess match between American aviation technology and North Vietnamese tactical innovation. Every successful helicopter landing demonstrated American technical superiority and pilot skill. Every aircraft shot down proved that numerical advantages and tactical preparation could overcome technological disparity under specific conditions. On July 3rd, the siege entered a new phase as American relief operations began taking shape. The 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division was assembled at Camp Evans and prepared for airlift operations designed to reinforce or evacuate the firebase's defenders. Artillery support was coordinated from multiple firebases throughout the region, creating interlocking fields of fire that could deliver devastating bombardments on enemy positions. Most dramatically, B-52 strikes were planned for the valleys surrounding Ripcord, operations designed to disrupt enemy supply lines and command structure. But organizing effective relief operations required time that allowed North Vietnamese forces to strengthen their positions and prepare for American counterattack. Enemy engineering units dug bunkers and fighting positions that provided protection against aerial bombardment while maintaining fields of fire toward the firebase. Supply columns continued moving ammunition and reinforcements forward, replacing casualties and maintaining the combat strength necessary for sustained operations. Sergeant Dorsey watched American aircraft circling in the distance and understood that relief was being organized, but he also recognized that the firebase's defenders faced several more days of combat before help could arrive effectively. His M60 was showing signs of mechanical wear that raised questions about its continued reliability. Ammunition stocks had been reduced to basic combat loads that would last only a few hours if fighting resumed at the intensity of the previous day. More critically, the firebase's personnel were showing signs of combat fatigue that affected their tactical performance. Men who had fought continuously for 48 hours were making mistakes, failing to maintain proper fields of fire, responding slowly to enemy movement, and exhibiting the kind of psychological stress that degraded unit cohesion. Sleep deprivation, combined with the constant stress of expecting enemy attack, produces physiological changes that can prove as dangerous as enemy fire. The defenders of fire support base Ripcord were learning what military historians had documented throughout recorded warfare, that prolonged combat operations exact psychological costs that eventually affect tactical performance regardless of individual courage or unit training. The human nervous system has limitations that cannot be overcome through willpower alone, and these limitations become critical factors in extended combat operations. But American soldiers at Ripcord also demonstrated the adaptability that had characterized their military performance throughout history. They learned to sleep in shifts while maintaining defensive readiness. They developed techniques for sharing combat responsibilities that allowed individuals to rest while maintaining unit capability. Most importantly, they maintained the small unit leadership that kept defensive operations coordinated despite the loss of senior commanders and disruption of normal communication systems. The role of non-commissioned officers, like Sergeant Dorsey, became critical as formal command structures were disrupted by casualties and communication failure. These soldiers possessed the tactical knowledge and personal authority necessary to coordinate defensive operations at the squad and platoon level. Their decisions, where to position weapons, when to request helicopter resupply, how to distribute ammunition among different fighting positions, determined whether defensive operations remained effective or collapsed into individual survival efforts. The North Vietnamese attack on fire support base Ripcord represented sophisticated military planning that combined strategic intelligence with tactical innovation. Enemy forces had identified the firebase as a critical component of American operations in the A Shau Valley and devoted substantial resources to organizing an attack that would eliminate this strategic asset. The operation required coordination between multiple combat arms, including infantry, artillery, engineering, and logistics units that provided different capabilities to the overall effort. Intelligence preparation for the attack had included detailed reconnaissance of the firebase's defensive positions, identification of helicopter landing zones and approach routes, and analysis of American tactical paths that could be exploited. Enemy agents had observed American operations for months, noting the schedules and procedures that governed resupply operations, medical evacuations, and personnel rotations. This intelligence allowed North Vietnamese forces to plan their attack with precision that American commanders had not anticipated. The siege continued through July 4th, Independence, with a battle that seemed to mock the idealism that the holiday represented. American soldiers fought to defend their position while enemy forces worked to destroy it, creating a microcosm of the larger conflict that had divided American society and challenged traditional concepts of military victory. The irony was not lost on the participants. Men who had volunteered to defend democratic principle found themselves fighting for survival in a conflict where political objectives remained unclear. Sergeant Dorsey spent the 4th of July cleaning his weapon and preparing for another night of combat, understanding that patriotic holidays meant nothing to the machine gun that represented his primary responsibility. The M60 required maintenance regardless of calendar day, and enemy forces would not pause their operations to observe American national celebrations. The war had reduced existence to its most fundamental element, survival, duty, and the mechanical functioning of weapon systems that determined life or death. The helicopter crews who continued flying resupply missions to fire support base Ripcord demonstrated a form of patriotism that went beyond rhetoric or political symbolism. They risked their lives repeatedly to maintain supply lines that kept American soldiers alive and capable of continued resistance. Their dedication to mission accomplishment under impossible conditions represented the kind of service that defined military professionalism at its highest level, but the costs continued mounting. Another helicopter was shot down on July 4th, bringing total aircraft losses to 6 machines and 14 crew members. The mathematical relationship between mission requirements and available resources was approaching a crisis point where continued operations might become impossible, regardless of crew courage or tactical skill. Military aviation, like every other combat system, had operational limits that could not be exceeded indefinitely. The B-52 strikes that began falling on the valleys around fire support base Ripcord on July 5th represented American military power at its most devastating level. Each aircraft carried 30 tons of high explosive bombs that created destruction visible from space. The psychological effect of B-52 attacks was often as important as their material damage. The earth-shaking explosions and mushroom clouds rising above the jungle demonstrated American capability to deliver overwhelming force when tactical conditions justified such measures. But strategic bombing, despite its spectacular effects, could not solve the tactical problem faced by Ripcord's defenders. North Vietnamese forces had prepared positions that provided protection against aerial attack, while maintaining the capability to engage American forces at close range. The complex terrain around the firebase offered numerous concealment opportunities that allowed enemy forces to avoid destruction while continuing military operations. Sergeant Dorsey watched the B-52 strikes from his position and recognized that American firepower was being brought to bear with unprecedented intensity. But he also understood that the firebase's immediate survival continued to depend on the defensive fires delivered by weapons like his M60. Strategic systems could disrupt enemy operations and inflict casualties, but tactical survival required individual soldiers making correct decisions about immediate threats. The siege of fire support base Ripcord had become a laboratory for testing every assumption about modern warfare. American technological superiority was being challenged by enemy tactical innovation. Strategic mobility provided by helicopter operations was being countered by patient preparation and accumulated local advantages. Most fundamentally, the battle was testing whether American soldiers could maintain effective resistance when isolated from the logistical systems that supported conventional military operations. By July 6th, the tactical situation had achieved a deadly equilibrium. North Vietnamese forces maintained pressure on the firebase through mortar and rocket fire while avoiding large-scale assaults that would expose them to American defensive firepower. American forces conserved ammunition and waited for relief operations that were being organized with increasing urgency. Both sides understood that the outcome would depend on which force could maintain operations longer under conditions that were testing human endurance level. The helicopter operations that continued throughout the siege had evolved into a complex choreography of aircraft, crew coordination, and ground support that represented military aviation at its most sophisticated level. Pilots learned to navigate by reference to enemy muzzle flashes and the sound of weapons fire. Crew chiefs developed techniques for rapid loading and unloading of supplies, while aircraft remained in vulnerable hover positions. Door gunners accumulated target identification skills that allowed them to engage enemy positions effectively while avoiding friendly fire incidents. But the helicopter crews were paying an increasing price for their tactical proficiency. Fatigue from repeated combat missions was affecting decision-making and aircraft handling skills. Mechanical stress from sustained operations was causing equipment failures at rates that exceeded maintenance capacity. Most critically, the pool of experienced crews was being reduced by casualties that could not be replaced quickly enough to maintain operational effectiveness. Captain Estes had survived more combat missions than statistical analysis indicated was possible, but he continued flying because his experience and skill were irreplaceable assets for the soldiers depending on helicopter resupply. His aircraft showed the effects of repeated combat exposure, bullet holes that had been patched, metal fatigue from high-stress maneuvering, and worn components that approached the limits of their operational life. Like his crew, the helicopter was being consumed by the demands of sustained combat. The North Vietnamese forces surrounding fire support base Ripcord were also showing signs of attrition from prolonged combat operations. Ammunition stocks for heavy weapons were being depleted faster than supply columns could replace them. Casualties among assault troops were reducing combat effectiveness, despite replacement personnel being moved forward continuously. Most importantly, maintaining siege operations required resources that limited enemy capabilities for other operations throughout the region. But the North Vietnamese possessed advantages that allowed them to sustain operations longer than their American opponent. They operated on familiar terrain with supply lines that were less vulnerable to interdiction. Their casualties could be replaced from local recruitment that was not subject to the political constraints affecting American personnel policies. Most critically, they could afford to accept strategic stalemate as a victory while American forces were under pressure to achieve decisive results. The battle for fire support base Ripcord had become a test of national will, conducted through the actions of individual soldiers who understood that their survival depended on tactical competence and personal courage. Sergeant Dorsey represented thousands of American soldiers who found themselves fighting in a war where traditional concepts of victory and defeat had become meaningless. His M60 machine gun had become both weapon and symbol, a mechanical device that delivered firepower and a representation of American determination to resist defeat. On July 7th, intelligence reports began indicating that North Vietnamese forces were preparing for a major assault designed to overrun fire support base Ripcord before American relief operations could prove effective. Enemy troop movements suggested that fresh forces were being committed to the battle, including specialized assault units equipped with flamethrowers and satchel charges designed to eliminate fortified positions. The tactical indicators pointed toward a climactic battle that would determine the firebase's fate. The American response involved accelerating relief operations while reinforcing the firebase's defensive capability. Additional helicopter flights brought fresh ammunition and replacement personnel to maintain defensive positions that had been weakened by casualty. Artillery support was coordinated to provide continuous fire on suspected enemy assembly areas. Most importantly, tactical air support was organized to provide close support during the expected enemy assault. But the defenders of fire support base Ripcord understood that their survival would ultimately depend on their ability to deliver effective fires during the critical moments when enemy forces approached within hand grenade range of their positions. The M60 machine guns positioned around the perimeter represented the primary defensive weapon that could generate sufficient firepower to break up enemy assault forces. Their effectiveness would determine whether the firebase held or fell during the coming attack. Sergeant Dorsey spent July 7th preparing for what every soldier recognized would be the decisive battle. He cleaned and test-fired his weapon, arranged ammunition supplies for maximum accessibility, and rehearsed the barrel change procedure would keep his gun operational during sustained firing. His preparations represented the kind of professional attention to detail that separated combat veterans from inexperienced soldiers, understanding that small technical factors could determine survival during moments when there was no time for improvisation. The night of July 7th passed quietly, with both sides completing their preparations for the battle begin at dawn. American soldiers maintained watch schedules that provided defensive coverage while allowing maximum rest for personnel who would need their full capabilities during the coming engagement. North Vietnamese forces moved into assault positions while avoiding actions that would alert American observers to their exact locations and intentions. At 05:30 hours on July 8th, the final battle for fire support base Ripcord began with a bombardment that exceeded anything the defenders had previously experienced. More than 500 mortar and rocket rounds fell within the firebase perimeter during the first 20 minutes, systematically destroying defensive positions and eliminating key weapons systems. The bombardment was followed immediately by ground assault from 3 directions, with enemy forces advancing under cover of smoke and explosives that obscured their movements. Sergeant Dorsey opened fire with his M60 as the first enemy soldiers appeared through the smoke, sending tracers toward targets that moved between craters and destroyed bunkers. His weapons cycled with mechanical precision, delivering sustained fire that forced enemy forces to seek cover while attempting to advance. But the volume of return fire indicated that this assault was being conducted by forces much larger than anything previously encountered at Ripcord. The battle that followed represented infantry combat at its most intense level. Enemy forces advanced to within meters of American positions, creating a chaotic engagement where survival depended on split-second decisions and individual courage. Machine gun fire, rifle fire, grenades, and finally hand-to-hand combat merged into a continuous roar of violence that lasted for more than 3 hours. But the North Vietnamese assault, despite its intensity and numerical superiority, could not overcome the defensive advantages provided by American firepower and tactical skill. Machine gun positions like Sergeant Dorsey's delivered interlocking fires that broke up enemy formations before they could coordinate effective assault tactics. Artillery support from surrounding fire bases provided continuous bombardment of enemy assembly area, preventing reinforcements from reaching the assault forces. Most critically, helicopter operations continued throughout the battle, delivering ammunition resupply that kept American weapons operational and evacuating casualties that would otherwise have reduced defensive effectiveness. The air mobility that provided American forces with strategic advantages also proved decisive at the tactical, allowing isolated units to maintain combat operations that would otherwise have proven impossible. By 08:30 hours on July 8th, the North Vietnamese assault had been repelled with heavy casualties on both sides. Enemy forces withdrew to positions beyond the range of effective defensive fire, while American forces consolidated their remaining positions and prepared for continued resistance. The firebase had survived its most serious test, but at costs that raised questions about the sustainability of continued operation. The helicopter that landed at Fire Support Base Ripcord during the afternoon hours of July 8th brought news that changed everything. The 101st Airborne Division had decided to abandon the firebase and withdraw its personnel to more defensible positions. The strategic value of controlling this particular mountaintop had been judged insufficient to justify the costs of continued operation. Fire support base Ripcord would be evacuated. The decision represented one of the most difficult choices that military commanders face, withdrawing from positions that soldiers have died to defend. The strategic logic was sound. Ripcord had served its purpose of disrupting enemy operations in the A Shao Valley, and continued operations would require resources that could be better employed elsewhere. But for the soldiers who had fought to defend the firebase, evacuation felt like abandonment of their fallen comrade. Sergeant Dorsey received the evacuation order with mixed emotions. Relief at surviving the siege was balanced by sorrow at leaving positions that had been purchased with American blood. His M60 had fired more than 15,000 rounds during the battle for Ripcord, contributing to defensive operations that had prevented enemy forces from achieving their objective. But military success measured in tactical terms felt hollow when strategic decisions invalidated the purposes for which men had died. The evacuation of fire support base Ripcord began on July 23, 1970, and required the same helicopter operations that had sustained the base throughout the siege. Aircraft landed under fire to embark personnel and equipment, conducting operations that were as dangerous as any resupply mission. The North Vietnamese forces surrounding the firebase maintained pressure on evacuation operations, understanding that every helicopter they destroyed represented a tactical victory regardless of strategic outcome. Captain Estes flew repeatedly into fire support base Ripcord during the evacuation, demonstrating the same courage that had characterized helicopter operations throughout the siege. His final flight carried Sergeant Dorsey and the last elements of the firebase's defenders, ending a battle that had tested every assumption about American military capabilities in Vietnam. As the helicopter lifted off from the firebase for the last time, both crew and passengers understood that they were leaving behind more than just a military position. The statistics of the battle for fire support base Ripcord told only part of the story. 75 Americans had been killed and 434 wounded during the 23-day siege. Enemy casualties were estimated at more than 400 killed, though exact numbers could never be verified. 8 American helicopters had been lost along with their crews. The firebase itself was destroyed by American forces to prevent its equipment from falling into enemy hands. But numbers could not capture the human dimensions of what had occurred on that mountaintop in Thua Thien province. The battle had tested the limits of human endurance under conditions that exceeded anything in peacetime experience. Soldiers had discovered capabilities within themselves that they never suspected existed, while also learning about the costs of combat that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Dorsey returned to the United States in 1971, carrying with him memories that would never fade and skills that had no application in civilian. His experience at fire support base Ripcord had taught him lessons about courage, duty, and sacrifice that could not be communicated to people who had never faced comparable tests. Like thousands of other Vietnam veterans, he found himself isolated by experiences that defied explanation to anyone who had not shared them. The M60 machine gun that had been his primary responsibility throughout the siege was turned into military supply system and eventually destroyed as surplus equipment. The weapon that had delivered defensive fires crucial to the survival of Ripcord's defenders became another statistical entry in logistics records that documented the material consumption of modern warfare. But for the men who had depended on its mechanical reliability, the machine gun represented something that transcended its engineering specifications. Years later, veterans of the battle for fire support base Ripcord would gather to commemorate their shared experience and honor the memory of comrades who had not survived. These reunions served purposes that went beyond nostalgia or social interaction. They provided opportunities for men to process experiences that had fundamentally changed their understanding of human nature and national purpose. The conversation invariably returned to those 23 days in July 1970, when ordinary soldiers had demonstrated extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. The helicopter crews who had sustained fire support base Ripcord throughout the siege scattered to different assignments and eventually to civilian careers that could never provide the sense of purpose and teamwork that they had experienced in combat. Captain Estes continued flying until his retirement from the Army, accumulating more than 4,000 combat flight hours and receiving decorations that acknowledged his contribution to American military operations in Vietnam. But like his passengers and crew members, he understood that recognition could never fully capture what they had accomplished together. The North Vietnamese forces who had besieged fire support base Ripcord achieved their strategic objective of forcing American withdrawal from the A Shau Valley, contributing to the larger political goals that would eventually result in American departure from Vietnam. Their tactical success demonstrated that determination and careful preparation could overcome technological advantages under specific conditions. But their casualties had been severe, and the battle had consumed resources that limited their capabilities for other operations. The battle for fire support base Ripcord represented one chapter in a larger story of American military involvement in Southeast Asia that ended with strategic failure despite countless examples of tactical success. The courage and skill demonstrated by soldiers like Sergeant Dorsey could not overcome political and strategic factors that determined the ultimate outcome of the Vietnam War. Their service honored American military traditions, while also revealing the limitations of military power when applied to political problems that required different solutions. Fire support base Ripcord was never rebuilt. The mountaintop that had witnessed 23 days of sustained combat returned to jungle that gradually reclaimed the fighting position, helicopter landing zone, and bunkers that had been constructed by American engineers. Nature proved more persistent than military technology, erasing the physical evidence of battles that had seemed so crucial to the men who fought them. But the human legacy of fire support base Ripcord persists in the memories of survivors and the families of men who died defending positions that were eventually abandoned. Their sacrifice was not meaningless, though its meaning may be different from what they originally understood. They demonstrated qualities of courage, endurance, and mutual loyalty that represent the finest traditions of American military service, even when applied to strategic objectives that proved unattainable. The helicopter operations that sustained fire support base Ripcord established tactical precedents that influenced American military doctrine for decades. The integration of air mobility with ground operations became a fundamental component of Army operations, while the courage and skill demonstrated by helicopters provided inspiration for subsequent generations of military aviators. The lessons learned during those 23 days in July contributed to tactical innovations that improved American military effectiveness in later conflict. Sergeant Michael Dorsey's defense of fire support base Ripcord with his M60 machine gun exemplified the individual courage and technical competence that characterized American soldiers throughout the Vietnam War. His story represents thousands of similar narratives involving ordinary people who rose to meet extraordinary challenges with resources drawn from training, character, and commitment to comrades. These individual stories, taken together, constitute the human foundation upon which American military capabilities ultimately depend. Today, as we reflect on the battle for fire support base Ripcord and the courage of men like Sergeant Dorsey, we are reminded that freedom's preservation often depends on the willingness of ordinary citizens to make extraordinary sacrifices in circumstances they never chose but could not avoid. Their service deserves our remembrance, not because it achieved perfect strategic results, but because it demonstrated the human qualities that make democratic societies worth defending. What does it mean to hold the line when the line itself seems to be drawn in shifting sand? How do we honor sacrifices made for objectives that history judges differently than those who made the sacrifices understood them? These questions, raised by the battle for fire support base Ripcord, continue to challenge our understanding of military service and national purpose in ways that demand our continued reflection and respect. The jungle around Ripcord remains quiet now, disturbed only by the sounds of wind and rain that outlast human conflict. But the memory of those 23 days in July 1970 persists in the hearts and minds of those who understand that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of their strategic outcome, because they test and reveal the character of the people who fight them. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and endurance has moved you, please like and subscribe to help us continue sharing these vital stories that honor the memory of those who dedicated their lives to preserving our freedom. Share this video with others who value the service and sacrifice of the men and women who answered their country's call in its hour of need. Their memory deserves our continued remembrance and respect.